Thank you for joining us today. I'm Kay McCall. I am the Executive Director of the Renewable Energy Alliance Houston, which we refer to as Real Houston. We are a newly launched organization dedicated to connecting, attracting, and growing the businesses and professionals needed for the energy transition so that Houston will remain the energy capital of the world. First, I want to be sure to thank our corporate sponsors, Sonova, EDF, Pattern, Wilkie Farr and Gallagher, and HBW Resources. Second, I'd like to ask that if you have a question for Michael Skelly today, would you please use the Q&A function so that we can take a look and get to as many of those questions as we can. That would be wonderful. Speaking of our speaker, I'm proud to introduce Michael Skelly. Skelly has been a key leader in the evolution of the renewable energy industry in the United States. You can actually read about his journey in the book Superpower. I have a prop by Russell Gold. It's a great read, and there's more in it than just Skelly. So if you end up, thinking you want to know more about the industry, it's a really well-written book. But let me outline a few points. Skelly was born in Manchester, England, which you won't be able to tell by his accent. He arrived in the United States by boat when he was 2 years old. After growing up in Virginia, he went to Notre Dame for college and got his business degree from Harvard. Skelly was an early mover in the renewable energy industry, and I would say it's not hyperbole to say that the wind industry may not be where it is without what Michael Skelly did in the early years. He was one of the first two employees of Horizon Wind Energy, and he helped lead Horizon to prominence in the industry as a multi-billion-dollar company. This accelerated the growth of wind energy as the company grew. And as somebody who was active in the industry at the same time, I can say that Horizon was the big dog in those years. Later in his career, Skelly launched Clean Line Energy, a transmission company, and it did not go quite as well as Horizon, and you're free to ask him about that. Currently, Skelly is a senior advisor for Lazard here in Houston. He's very active in the community in both renewable energy and in promoting bike trails and involved in different transportation initiatives, among many other interests. Skelly was a driving force behind, was one of the driving forces behind Real Houston, and we are delighted to have him here with us today. Skelly, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Great. Okay. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And on Clean Line, it is our fervent hope that the second mouse gets a cheese. We sold off some of those, well, just about all of our projects to other folks, and knock on wood, at least one of those will be in construction perhaps this year. And but before I begin, I just want to thank Kay for everything that you're doing. We met Kay a little over a year ago and explained that we're trying to start this renewable energy group, that we had to have a group to bring people together in Houston other than just sort of walking around Finn Hall and bumping into random people who might be mixed up in renewables. And Kay immediately cottoned to the idea. She had just had a very successful stint at Noble Wind, and had seen that through the sale to Carlisle, had come back to Houston, which is home for her, where she got her start in the energy industry. And she has just jumped on this task here to create just a fundamentally important part of the clean energy ecosystem that we really need in Houston, which I'll talk a little bit more about that further on in the presentation. So if your company's name was not on the list of company sponsors that Kay rattled off, you can be on that list. And so contact Kay. If you're new to the industry and want to get involved, we can, we're basically an all volunteer organization at this point. We are getting some financial support from the sponsors that Kay mentioned, but it's super important that we have this to stay on top here in Houston. So let me, the idea behind this discussion today was to have a sort of a broad discussion about renewable energy and where's the industry, what's the role that Houston is playing and might play in the future. And it's my hope that the presentation will elicit lots of questions, of course, but also give folks who are new to renewables a good overview of the industry. And I know there's a bunch of veterans of the industry on the call as well, so I will try to keep it interesting and lively for you all as well. But you can, if something I'm saying is totally obvious, you can just put master of the obvious in the chat box, and I'll try to move along as quickly as possible. So it's great to be here. Let me see here if I can just get the presentation on the screen, and then we can begin. All right, here we go. So where are we today? We've got around 110 gigawatts of wind, 85 gigawatts of solar capacity. That's getting close to 20% of the installed capacity in the US. Wind and solar don't run as often because of the sun isn't always shining and the wind isn't always blowing. But we're approaching 9% of electricity, 8% plus every day it increases of our energy mix from wind and solar. If you come from the oil and gas industry, one way to think about this is, if all of a sudden we just said, all right, we're going to shut all this generation down, to replace that, you would need around 4 TCF of natural gas. And that's something over 10%, probably 12, 13% of US gas production. So it's a material amount of energy and growing all the time. Wind and solar are led the country, and this is not just in the United States, but really across the world, of new generation assets built in 2019. We were 2/3 of new projects built, new capacity built, up from about 28% in 2010. And when I got my start in the industry, we were probably like less than 1% of new build back in the year 2000. So industry's come along quite strongly. What's driving this is a big drop in the cost of renewables. And this is a graph that, as Kay mentioned, I'm a senior advisor at Lazard. We've been tracking this for more than a decade. And every year we do a study of overnight costs of new build and then back out the energy cost from those projects. These are unsubsidized numbers because the study that we do is beyond the United States. And for those of you all new to the industry, we have this kind of annoying habit of talking about the cost of energy in dollars per megawatt hour. If you want to sort of translate that into your household bill, on the lower right-hand corner, you'll see $54. That's 5.4 cents or 2.8 cents. And obviously with tax credits and so on, costs come in lower. When the cost of solar has dropped even more dramatically, almost 90% in the last decade, and we'll talk more about how it's going to keep on growing. We do, as I mentioned at Lazard, we do a levelized cost of energy study every year, and this sort of tracks how renewables compare on a marginal cost or a new build cost each year. So it's important to, if you've driven around the country, which a lot of folks are doing these days because of COVID, we're rediscovering our own country. You know that in West Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Iowa, et cetera, there are lots and lots of wind projects. And the reason for that is because the wind is much stronger in those places. And for the same reason that your car's mileage drops if you go from 55 to 70, because the wind resistance increases geometrically, for that same reason, the energy that's in a square meter of wind. Okay, so think of a square meter the wind is moving through. how much energy is in a square meter at 100 meters in the air at these different spots. This is shown in the map, and the graph shows how that increases with a cube of, so the energy contained in the wind increases with a cube of the velocity. So wind speed is tremendously important. We measure it again in how many watts per square meter. And we'll get back to the square meter question in just a minute here. On the solar side of things, the resource gradient, if you will, is less dramatic. And the difference between a really good solar site and a kind of marginal solar site isn't quite as big. And the way we measure solar energy is how many watts of energy per day on average hit again a square meter. This is sort of an obvious point, but in the desert Southwest and in far West Texas, we have better resources because fewer cloudy days. Closer to the equator also helps. So Texas is, we're leading the way in wind energy. We have about 30,000 megawatts, which is on the order of $45 billion of wind projects here in Texas. We're number 5 in solar. And from wind, we're getting, last year we got about 20% of our electricity here in Texas from wind energy. And we've had moments where our peak production has been 58%. So moments or hours when, if you look at all the energy used across Texas, 58% of that energy was coming from wind during those particular hours. And everybody expects that we're going to see continue to see a very dramatic growth in wind and solar here in Texas. In the just to give you a sense of this, in the counties surrounding Houston, there are about 6 gigawatts or 6,000 megawatts of solar in the queue. If all those projects came to pass, we'd have 6,000 megawatts of solar panels around the Houston area. And if those were installed, and many of them will be, then all the electricity that we're using right now in in Houston would be supplied by solar on a day like today. And the other thing that we're seeing in Texas is, again, because of these sort of same factors of relatively low barriers to entry, ready access to a transmission system, permitting barriers that aren't so difficult, and very robust energy markets, we're also seeing a lot of storage capacity coming online in Texas, and that will increase. This projection shows 1,000 megawatts in 2021. I'm pretty confident it's going to be considerably higher than that. So what have been the big drivers in wind and solar? They've basically been, it's sort of helpful construct, I think, to divide them into supply side incentives and then demand. And on the supply side, we've had something in place since the 90s called the production tax credit for wind, which basically says that the federal government would give you a tax credit of 2-point-something cents per kilowatt hour generated for 10 years. After 10 years, you're on your own. And on the solar side, we have something called the investment tax credit, which is that you can write off on your taxes 30% of the cost of a solar project. And that has had an important effect in bringing down the costs of renewables and increasing adoption around the country. On the demand side, early on, one of the big demand drivers was something called the Renewable Portfolio Standard, and those are now in place in 30 states. Texas was actually one of the early adopters. In 1999, as part of the deregulation, we adopted a very sort of small couple percent standard, which basically said if you're a retail provider in Texas, you have to acquire X, like 2 or 3% of your electricity from renewables. What happened then is companies went out to buy it. They found out how cheap it was. during the 2000s, we had a lot of volatility in the gas market, and wind was very appealing if you wanted sort of energy at a very stable cost. We have blown through the statutory renewable portfolio standard in Texas every single year, and that story has really played out around the country. And now we're moving to an interesting new sort of demand side paradigm where 14 states plus Washington, D.C. have made commitments of one sort or another, statutory, regulatory, et cetera, to have a zero carbon energy mix by 2050. So nukes and hydro will be included in that, but the great lion's share of new projects will be from wind and solar, barring some other invention that may come along. If you watched the debate the other night, you have to listen closely to get through the interruptions, but Biden did repeat his pledge that calls for 100% carbon-free energy on the grid by 2035. Lots of work to make that happen, and certainly a very ambitious goal, but that's now out there and part of his platform. The other big demand driver, especially in recent years, has been on the ESG side of things. So many companies around the country and really around the world have committed to various carbon reduction goals. And if you're a Walmart or a Microsoft or General Motors, et cetera, and you want to reduce the carbon impact of your operations, one of the first things that you can do is change your electricity mix. So go out to the market and sign up with a renewable energy producer and acquire 100% of your energy from renewable sources. And that's been a huge driver in the market in the last few years. And we've seen a lot of that, particularly here in Texas. So how does all this stuff work? Wind turbines are actually there's an elegant simplicity to them. You've got blades that are basically airfoils that drive the rotor around. You have a nacelle, and that's a box up on top where you've got a gearbox, and generators, controllers, brakes, instrumentation, et cetera, and then obviously the tower that holds everything up. Towers early on were made from lattice. Now they're typically made from tubular steel, but as turbines get taller and taller, we're starting to see concrete towers, at least in the base elements. So, and if you want to understand wind energy, all you got to do is remember your high school, or I think it's probably middle school, geometry, which is pi. And pi is wind energy's very, very best friend. And when I got in this business, 20 some years ago, the ship of the line was a Vestas V47 750 kilowatt turbine. And if you calculate the swept area, okay, of that rotor, and then calculate today's ultra modern General Electric Allied 220 meter rotor, the swept area of the GE Halide is 21 times larger than that of the V47. So the machine of, 20-ish years ago. That's just a dramatic increase in how much energy a turbine can capture. Another way to think about this is coming back to the sort of watts per meter point that I mentioned a little bit earlier. And I find this kind of an interesting way to think about wind, is if you measure the mass of the air that would move through the GE turbine, this big 12 megawatt offshore turbine, it's at a sort of normalish offshore breeze of 20 miles an hour. That is about 440 tons of air per second traveling through the plane of the rotor. And the job of that is to turn that wind energy into mechanical energy that drives the blades, and then ultimately creates electricity. 440 tons is a lot. That's like 440 if you're a hydro type person. That's obviously the same as 440 cubic meters of water, or almost, let's say 440. So that's, call that almost 5,000 cubic feet per second of water, which is, Buffalo Bayou at not at a full flood, but at a pretty good clip. So speaking of offshore turbines, one of the areas that we expect to see a lot of growth in over the next few years, and this is an opportunity, I think, for Houston, given how much offshore experience we have here in Houston, is offshore wind. And the costs of offshore wind have dropped very dramatically over the last decade. Used to be that offshore wind cost 20-something cents. Bids in Europe are in the 6-7 cent range today. And we've seen really low prices coming out of some of the offshore bids in the northeastern United States. And lots of projects getting done, many companies with a Houston presence. And one of the big advantages of offshore the big disadvantage, obviously, is that building anything in the water, particularly salty water, is more expensive and lots of maintenance challenges. But you can make turbines bigger and bigger, and you don't have the logistical. If you have a blade that's 110 meters long, that's pretty hard to drive down the interstate with a blade that long. But if you build those blades port side, you can put them on vessels, move them around the world, and get them out to wind turbines. And the same thing applies for rotors and towers and so on. So the big advantage is we don't really know what the limit is in terms of the size of offshore turbines, but we know that they'll continue to get bigger and bigger. And the dynamic that we've seen with offshore is similar to the dynamic with solar, where you see big procurements out of Europe. That creates volume, drives down costs, and that leads to further adoption in other parts of the world. So how do we integrate all this stuff? Solar is the most, it turns out the wind is actually a little bit easier to integrate because it's a 24/7 phenomena. And solar, as we all know, it shows up more at certain times of day. So in California, we have this famous phenomena, the California duck curve, and the little picture here illustrates that as more and more solar has been introduced to the grid in California, that means that the other generation has to ramp down, and then as the sun sets, then generation has to ramp up. That's why you see so much storage activity in Texas. We do not yet have a duck curve in Texas, but if you think about those 6,000 megawatts in Wharton County, or however many megawatts we built, it is likely that the ducks will be flying to Texas here before too long. And the other phenomena, this is like a pretty dense picture here on the right, but one of the important effects of introducing so much wind on the system is it drives down prices, and that's particularly the case when you don't either you don't build out the grid, or you build lots of generation in one spot. But the overall effect for consumers is actually pretty favorable, and that's the reason why in Texas we have some of the lowest wholesale rates out there. So storage is, again, as I mentioned, coming along very quickly. It's what storage does is you grab energy. If you go back to the duck for a second, so you store energy at periods when there's lots of production, and then you release it during periods of high demand. It's a fairly straightforward equation. The way we used to store energy, most of the storage in the United States is actually pump storage hydro. And what happened was in the 60s and 70s, we built lots of nuclear power plants, and nuclear power plants like to go 24/7. They don't like to go up and down. So they had the challenge of, okay, what do we do with all this energy at night? So they built pump storage facilities, and they pump water up to a reservoir on the top of a mountain during the nighttime. And then during the daytime, when power demand increased, they would run it through a turbine at the bottom of the hill, store the water in another reservoir, and so on, back and forth. That's how most storage, that's what most storage is in the United States. But with the advances in lithium-ion technology driven by your phone and increasingly by the automotive sector, costs are coming down very quickly. And as you can see from this chart, the more that costs come down, the more use cases you'll have. So lots of exciting stuff happening in storage. So how does all the development of this stuff work? So this is a dramatic oversimplification of what can be a long and torturous process. But if you're developing a wind project or a solar project, then you start thinking about, okay, what's the right market to be in? Let's go prospect, find ourselves some friendly landowners, sign up the land, do the resource assessment. In solar, this is pretty straightforward. On the wind side, it's much more complex because wind phenomena are driven often by terrain mechanisms and so on. So you need a lot of good on-site data. Think of that, if you're an oil and gas person, think of that as sort of the geology phase of the project. Then as you're moving the project along and you're comfortable with your resource assessment and you can get your head around the costs and what sort of turbine or panels you might use, then you're in a position to go and bid the project and look for one of these C&I customers or a local utility or a hedge provider and come up with a mechanism to enter into a long-term agreement, terms being from like 7 or 8 to 20 years, to sell the power. Once you've reached the holy grail of a power purchase agreement, then it's all systems go. Projects then get financed, fully engineered, permitting is finished out. In many cases, you have to, the way the grid works is you have to pay for the upgrade so that your power can flow. So that happens in this stage. And then projects are built and commissioned. And one of the nice things about renewables is the time for construction, that these other time intervals can be quite long, particularly the permitting and grid upgrades. But the actual construction itself is pretty fast. And you can put, many hundreds of millions of dollars into the ground in months, which from a project finance perspective, that's actually can be quite helpful. And then of course, 30 years of operations is the expected life of these projects. Sometimes more because we don't, there are projects in California that have been going more than 30 years and we don't really know how long they're going to last, but they're hanging in there. So what does the future hold for us? What's happening in Houston? Lots of cities, it's sort of game on, and like who's going to seize the crown of the renewable energy capital of the U.S. and of course in the world. It's a much bigger playing field, but we've got a decent start here. We got a lot of competition from Chicago, Denver, San Francisco, particularly on the solar side, Boston on the tech side. But we've got a lot. When I first moved to Houston in 2000, everybody else was in fossil generation and people were doing interesting projects with that company with a big E out front. People would look at me at cocktail parties like, you were doing what? Wind? 20 megawatt projects? Wow, we're doing like a 2,000 megawatt combined cycle gas project. So for a little while, it was lonely to do renewables in Houston. That changed in the latter part of the last decade when as costs continue to come down and more projects started to get built. But we've got most of the big players have some sort of presence here in Houston, from EDPR, which is headquartered here in Houston. Pattern has a big presence. EDF is here, Shell, BP, and so on. So there's lots of companies here. There's a lot of startup activity in Houston. A couple of storage companies, Key Capture and Broadreach. Broadreach is headquartered here, and Key Capture was sort of born here and has a nice presence. Fervo and QuidNet are both using different geological applications to either store or harness energy. Those are exciting companies. And then we're seeing a lot of interest from private equity and infrastructure funds to add renewables to their portfolios. And this is a truncated list of those companies. But particularly as ESG concerns have become more stronger and stronger, and the oil and gas sector has sort of hit a rough patch, we're seeing more and more companies investing who traditionally, and then of course the oil majors that I mentioned, with different strategies. Shell, BP, and Equinor are a little bit more on the production side. Chevron has made the decision that they're going to focus really hard on decarbonizing their oil and gas operations. They just entered into an interesting partnership with Algonquin to supply renewables for their facilities around the country. And as I mentioned at the outset, one of the most important things that we need to do and continue doing is to sort of build the ecosystem around this. And the city of Houston has written up a pretty ambitious climate action plan. I encourage you to read it. Laura Cottingham at the city and others did a great job with that, with the sponsorship of NRG. Very comprehensive plan. There's a lot to do. We need to actually go do all this stuff and make sure that we act upon the recommendations. Greentown Labs, you may have seen, which I'm on the board, the local advisory board of. We recently announced that we're going to set up next to the Ion in Midtown. Very excited about that. We'll have labs and so on where people can actually make and prototype new equipment. So if you've got a great renewable energy idea or clean energy idea, come talk to Greentown Labs about setting up shop there. And then of course, Renewable Energy Alliance Houston, which is a super important part of this ecosystem. And because the great thing about our sector is, it's generally a welcoming sector, and Houston is a welcoming city. So when people come to me to sort of say, how do I get into this space? The good news is that it's a fast-growing industry, so there's lots of people that are getting absorbed into it. You just got to sort of find the right match. So I go back and forth. I think Kay sort of to perhaps anticipate a question. How are we doing in this competition? Well, it's super competitive in terms of which cities will be the winners. Sometimes I'm really encouraged by things like the Climate Action Plan. Other times I go, oh my God, we're about to spend $10 billion on a giant freeway right through the middle of our city, and that doesn't seem like the right direction to go. So we sort of go back and forth. Some days I'm really excited and think, oh, we got it. And other days I'm like, oh my gosh, we got to get this right. So that's a quick rundown on what's happening in the renewable energy world and how it relates to Houston. One other thing I should add is that we're in Texas and ERCOT, and because of our location, ERCOT is really a hotbed for innovation. And being in Texas, because of the nature of our electric markets, that's another big advantage that I think we can take advantage of going forward. So with that, Kate, over to you, Kate. Thank you.
Thank you, Skelly. That was great. We've got a lot of questions. Let's see how we can do on getting through them. Here's one that's near and dear to my heart as a member of the board of the University of Houston Business School. How can the universities such as UT and A&M and U of H and Rice refocus their curriculum to maintain relevancy in a post-oil world, thinking specifically about their strong petroleum and chemical engineering programs?
Yeah, I think, well, that's a great question. and Kay, you're on the board of the U of H energy program, I think it's called. So you're a better person to answer the question than I am. But I think it's, this is sort of supply and demand. There's a lot of demand for this type of curriculum, and it feels to me like the schools that offer it up are going to stay relevant, and those that don't are going to have their challenges. And one of the, I think as young people think about our industry, one of the things that people, at least I hear from young people about the oil and gas sector, we have a cyclical industry in renewables, and it's really hot for a while and then it slows down, but it's nothing like the cyclicality of the oil business. And I think because of the sort of steady growth that we're going to see, you can really feel you can invest in educational programs and so on with a greater degree of confidence than perhaps in around oil and gas curricula.
Yeah, and I would add to that, like you said, I'm involved at University of Houston. The first step is for the universities to start soliciting input from veterans and in the renewable industry and in other industries which are going to be on the growth curve. And again, U of H has started that, and I presume other schools are as well. But it's key, and it's also key to Houston taking the role of prominence that it should. And with these tier 1 universities, with Rice, A&M, and U of H, we're in a great position to have a research triangle, if you will, right here in this part of Texas. So here's one. What would you have done differently with Clean Line regarding Plains and Eastern? Yeah,
okay. Well, first of all, read the book if you want the whole rundown. And by the way, I don't get royalties from the book. Russell interviewed us for a period of years, and the deal was he could write whatever he wanted to write, and I had no editorial say on which was kind of a bet, like, is this guy going to be nice to me or not? I think actually he was far too nice and didn't talk enough about this. But yeah, I think we were probably a little early. So it was very obvious to us the need for transmission in 2010, 2009, when we started the company. But sometimes we don't do things until they're hitting us over the head. So we were probably 4 or 5 years too early. The other thing is that solar cost curve that you saw, when we started out, the Southeast had no alternative. If they wanted renewables, they needed a line like ours to get them. And solar, the bottom fell out of solar. That probably hurt us as well. If you think about the Southeast going toward the goals that we heard about, then you actually do need lines like the Plains and Eastern line. And then there are various points in time where you go man, I wish we hadn't spent money on that one. I wish we had that money now. And that's, sort of part of goes with the territory. But part of the reason we started the company was everybody talks about transmission and it's so important and we got to do this and so on. And I'd been to loads of transmission conferences, and I said, gee, this is somebody's got to go figure this thing out. And it felt like on the strength of the success of Horizon that we could, sort of test the thesis. I'm confident that at least a couple of our projects actually get done by new owners, and then our investors they've already got some of their money back, but they'll be on the way to hopefully getting all of it back. So, this is how we figure things out in this country as well. We figure things out by some hard-headed protagonist trying to knock down the barriers, figure out how does this work, what are the lessons. This is not Brazil or China, where you have a technocratic, more powerful central government that says, okay, we've got this problem, let's build these lines. And that's how big grid projects have gotten done in Brazil and China, is because they've been driven by central government. That's not how we do things in the gas pipeline world, not how we do things in the transmission world. So we needed somebody to go sort of figure this thing out, and it was us. And it's our hope that the second mouse gets the cheese on these projects. So no regrets, if that's part of the question.
Yeah. Here's a question following up on your slide about offshore wind. Can offshore wind energy generated in the Gulf of Mexico compete in ERCOT? And if so, when will it be able to do that?
Not yet. Not yet. You know, you can get offshore like wind, you know, within a couple of miles of the coast. So I think we're a ways out. Maybe it's a question of like, when do turbines get, you know, when do we have a 25 megawatt turbine and you put a dozen of those offshore and all of a sudden it's like killer cheap and it competes with ERCOT. But I think that's probably a ways out.
Here's one on distributed generation. Would distributed generation policies be a benefit to introduce more solar, or do you think that smart grid implementation required as flow may start running upstream would discourage more renewable penetration?
As Kay mentioned, my wife and I live in a restored fire station and we have solar panels on the roof because I wanted to sort of live that myself. And just to kind of see what it's like to have solar panels and how much would they produce and so on. The cost of distributed is, you know, it's like $2,000 a kW versus like $900 if you're doing utility scale. In a place like Texas, we got lots of land that you can do utility scale projects on. I think we're many years from rooftop solar and batteries displacing the grid, because people want 99999 reliability for their electric supply, and it's incredibly difficult to do that on a distributed basis. And if you sort of step way back in terms of this question of do we need the grid in the future, I think the world always tends toward more network solutions. If you think about like from we were, you know, in caves and the savannah, and then we started having networks with other people in caves, and then, you know, that created full-fledged commerce and so on. The world tends toward a more networked world, and I think that in the case of electric power production, that's still going to continue to be the case.
So we have a few questions here that create a theme, really relating to how people can get into careers related to renewable, clean energy, or et cetera. And what advice do you have for people who either been in oil and gas or some other line of work? Would you suggest going back to school and getting a different degree, or what's your advice?
Yeah. So, well, you're doing something right because you showed up on this webinar. So it's pretty annoying for people like that have been in the industry for a long time, and somebody shows up and says, hey, I really want to be in renewable energy. And you're like, what have you done? And they haven't done anything except call you. So don't be that person. Study up, participate in webinars. There's lots of online learning you can do. There's certificate programs that you can do, and it's fun and it's super interesting. So even if you're not going to get involved in renewables, if you're going to stay in oil and gas, for example, you should do these things because it's just interesting, and it's important if you're in other types of energy to understand what's going on in renewables. So show a real interest, get involved in Real Houston, and that could be like help with the mailing list or promote events or put events together. So it's really like anything else. And then try to draw the connections between sort of what you're doing, if you're doing finance or operations, with a sort of a parallel thing happening in the renewables industry. And it may be that you have to make a parallel move or step down a notch because and then it may be sort of a bounce pass where you go over here and then there. It may not be sort of you may not find a direct hop over to your dream job. The other thing that I would point out is that renewable energy is it's a little bit more commoditized. The returns aren't as good. They're more stable, but not as good. And, you know, the oil and gas industry, when times are good, they're really good. And people make money up and down the value chain. And it's episodically more profitable than renewables. But renewables are a little bit more stable. So just particularly as you get into sort of more senior levels, the comp is somewhat different, but it's energy, and I think as everybody on the call knows, this energy is a super exciting business, and there's a ton of change happening, which always keeps you on your toes. So the other thing that I would say finally, and then I'll shut up on this topic, is there is a role for you in renewable energy. If you can sort of string a sentence together and show commitment, you'll find a spot. It may not be your dream job right out of the box, but there's a role because the industry is growing really quickly. And just about every company that I know of has a search for somebody. So those are my quick thoughts. Not so quick perhaps, but lots of thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I get the same question a lot, and everything you said, I completely agree with, especially with the point about taking the initiative to learn something, because culturally, the two industries are very different. And I've worked in midstream oil and gas, and I've worked in power, both conventional and renewable. And it's different. And for a lot of years, there was a lot of negativity directed at the renewable industry. And so there is an interest in seeing that people are truly committed, that they're not just looking to hide out for a couple of years until the oil and gas price curve goes back up. So people will be looking for that commitment.
Yep.
Yeah. So here's one on RPS standards, et cetera. Do you think renewable growth moving forward will continue to be driven by renewable portfolio standards, which, for those not familiar, those are standards at different states of how much energy, sometimes they're guidelines, sometimes they're standards, are generated by renewable facilities? Or do you anticipate new federal legislation, or will it be just market factors like cost or consumer preference?
Yeah. So I would say, well, okay, so first off, renewable portfolio standards, we've blown through all those goals in almost every single state where we have standards where we've already doubled or trebled them. So they're not a big driver of the market. It's really sort of the cost. And then the big driver, I think, over the next decade is going to be a drive toward getting carbon out of the generation stack. And that'll be the big driver. Part of the question is what
will drive the growth?
What will drive the growth? At a federal level, I mean, as y'all know, there's an election in a few weeks. Vote, please. And if Trump is reelected, I think we'll still see kind of a pretty strong trajectory because the commercial industrial customers, the state-by-state drive for zero carbon energy, we're going to still see a pretty strong sector. If Biden prevails, then I think he'll really step on the gas. And there's a few reasons why I think we'll see a lot more growth. Even we're seeing a lot of growth now, but we'll see even more. One is that actually in both cases, interest rates are going to stay low, and renewable energy is very capital intensive. And so a low interest rate environment is quite favorable. And then Biden will, it's hard to tell. He hasn't talked about carbon legislation. Big question, even if the Democrats control the Senate, could they get carbon legislation through the Senate? And so the push, and if you sort of read his platform, it's around supply side incentives. We talked about supply and demand side incentives, and the supply side incentives, I think, those would be what pushes the carbon heavy resources out of the generation stack. Is there a clean energy standard or a national renewable portfolio standard, et cetera? We don't know yet because there's this goal of zero carbon. It's like, okay, how do we get there? And it's not 100% clear. And I think but I think it will be a focus. very early if Biden were to win, because if you think about the levers that he might have, and the economic levers that he might have, there's obviously a number of them, but renewable energy checks lots of boxes. It's great in red states. It helps on the environment. There's a bunch of social justice considerations around cleaning the air, et cetera. So I think we'll see a big push if Biden is to win.
You know, I would add there are two other factors that will likely come into play. We've got aging coal plants that the owners of those plants are not interested in investing the money to keep them running, which means that that amount of generation will need to be replaced. And you also are seeing investor preferences toward cleaner investments. And there's going to be some impact in how money's allocated, because ESG is as important now as it was pre-COVID. At least that's what surveys are showing. So there are a couple of other influences. Yep. So it's a confluence. Yep. Speaking of an interesting topic about confluence, how are the cultural significance of oil and gas in Texas? How will that impact Houston's ability to transition into a clean energy city?
Yeah, I mean, we do have among our challenges is like there's great things about lots of great things about being in Texas, including weather like today. But we have ERCOT, which I mentioned a few minutes ago, this sort of fantastic laboratory for innovation on the electric power side. In Houston, we got a little bit of a branding problem, and we just need to lean into that, and which is why building the kind of ecosystem around renewables is so important. But I think we can overcome that. I'm actually, I have various disagreements with the Greater Houston Partnership, but they are, and particularly with Bobby Tudor's current presidency of the partnership, they're leaning in pretty hard on this question of how do we make sure that we maintain leadership in energy. And the Greater Houston Partnership talks about global warming and carbon and things like that. That was inconceivable, like just a few years ago. So I think we're making some progress there. These transitions take a long time, but I'm encouraged by all that.
Here's an interesting question. Do you see Houston banking groups covering more renewables and power? And this is being asked by a Rice business student who would like to do banking in Houston post MBA, but so much of that coverage comes out of New York.
Man, we're like, you know, it feels like the whole world is getting more dispersed. So will there be more banks? Yeah. I mean, I think so. Simmons just issued a report, which is a really good report. They sort of dropped renewables coverage and they just picked it back up. If you haven't seen Pierce Hammond's summary on that, it's definitely worth a read. I can see some of the other banks sort of moving in this direction. So I maybe not today, but over the next few years, I think you'll see more and more bank presence here.
Well, there's so many great questions here. We could have done the whole hour just with the really great questions that are out here. How important is renewing the PTC and ITC, which are tax credit programs, for future growth in renewables? Are these projects still economic without the credits?
Generally, yeah, they are. And we could debate. There's actually people who would, like, in the renewable industry, who would say, like, can we just get rid of this and make life a lot simpler? It would reduce the capital stack, so or reduce the tax equity that you use is more expensive often than true equity. So big simplification of the capital stack would be really helpful. And in the current COVID crisis, because you're relying on tax credits, when companies can't project how much taxes are going to pay, that's driven up the cost of tax equity. So I think the one thing is that that's how we make energy policy in this country, is we monkey around with a tax code, not just energy policy, but housing policy, lots of policy. We use the tax code to make policy because it feels like we're not really, won't offend anybody. So I think we'll still see some sort of tax incentives for a while, but it is becoming more and more difficult to justify the, 2 point something cents on wind and so on. So I think we'll see some modifications.
Well, we're right at the top of the hour. We have so many more questions that I would love to actually hear your answers on, but I want to be respectful of the fact that it's almost 1 o'clock. So I want to apologize to the people that we didn't get to your questions. There wasn't a question on here that wasn't really a great question. And I guess, Skelly, we're going to have to do this again because these are great questions that people have, and you're a good guy to answer them. So
thank you, Kay. Let me ask you a question. How do people get involved in Real Houston? What can they do? How do they join, etc.?
So the most direct line to Real Houston is through our LinkedIn page. And then when you go to our LinkedIn page, you'll also see a link to our website where you can sign up to be on our email distribution. We post about everything on LinkedIn, but we're about to start having a newsletter, which is going to be new for us. And as we have events, we truly appreciate people promoting them and commenting and sharing. And also we're very interested in getting input on what kind of events people would like to see. So let us know what you would like to see. Feel free to connect with me. You've got my email address. If you got the email from us, you can find me on LinkedIn. And I'm happy to talk. I love talking to people about what they're interested in seeing. We have a lot of other events that are coming up, and some of them will involve, involve different topics. So we're going to continue to work on this idea of providing basic information to people, so that they can learn about the renewable energy industry, but we also want to have topics that are going to be important to people who've been in the industry a long time. We want to highlight innovators and the Houston's infrastructure for innovation, which is quite impressive. And we want to create networking opportunities. So connect with us, comment, give me your views, and join our mailing list would all be fantastic. And corporate sponsors, give me a call. And speaking of which, thank you again to Sonova and EDF, Pattern, Wilkie Farr, and HBW Resources, who have enabled us to launch this organization even in 2020. So, that's what is it? The renewable industry is the business of overcoming obstacles, right, Skelly?
That's it.
So
thank you all very much.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining. Really appreciate it. And we will have a copy of the recording available, and I'll talk to Skelly about the slides as well. So
yeah, we'll put them up.
All right. Thanks everybody.
Take care.